Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening to all those online and here live. Welcome to the Shiur on Chanukah. I've posted the link in the chat function for those of you who didn't manage to download the link beforehand. You can just click on the link and you should be able to see the sources. And I wanted really to try and contextualize the story of Chanukah, very relatively briefly to contextualize it historically and geographically, and then after that to contextualize it spiritually or midrashically, because there's a very interesting and relatively unknown sequence of chazals and midrashim that give at least the background context of the Chanukah story an interesting angle and slant, and perhaps present an alternative history, a history in which the partnership between the Greeks and the Jews could have been very different. I spoke briefly on Shabbos, and I mentioned the relationship between the words Sion and Yovon, Yud Vav Nun, and Tzadik Yud Vav Nun, and perhaps it's a subject for another shiur, the potential for partnership that Chazal saw between the Greeks and the Jews. Yaft Elokim Yefes V'Yishkoin Ba'arei Shem. Yefes, who are the ancestors of the Greeks, were perceived as being welcome guests in Aharei Shem, in the tents of Shem, as long as they are there under our terms rather than their own terms. And one way of viewing the tragedy of the Greek Jewish encounter is that this went wrong, and that this was a partnership that was unable to succeed. Now, the first source that I printed comes from the very famous words of the Mo's Tzor Piyut, or poem. We don't know much about the history, actually, of Mo's Tzor, despite its popularity. We think it arose sometime in the 13th century. We know that it originated from the world of Ashkenaz, of Germany. We know its author's name is Mordechai, hence the initials that open the verses that form the word Mordechai. Which Mordechai this was and what the story behind this Mordechai was is unclear. There is another Mordechai we know of who was an author of poems. The Mayofit Zemer is authored by someone called Mordechai, so this may have been the same Mordechai. There is a Baal Tosfos, one of the Bali Tosfos, who's called Mordechai. There's a Mordechai who we know about whose father-in-law was martyred in Mainz in Germany. So it may have been one of those, but it certainly rose from the milieu, the culture of Crusade and post-Crusade Germany, and Moisor became this exceptionally popular song. Now, each verse talks about a different exile or tragedy or challenge in Jewish history. And the verse we're going to look at is the one that talks, of course, about the Chanukah story. And I wanted to highlight a couple of words that are used. So let's have a look at what it says. Yevonim nikbatzu alai, the Greeks gathered against me. Azai b'mei Chashmonim, and then in the days of the Chashmonaim, the Hasmoneans. Ufotzu chomos migdolai, they breached the walls of my towers. V'timu kalashmonim, and they defiled all the oils. Uminosa kankanim, and from the remnants of the flasks, nasa neis l'shoshanim, a miracle was wrought for the Shoshanim, which in English are translated as roses. B'nei Vina, men of insight, Yemei Shmona, established 8 days. Kovu, they established Shiur Anonim as days of song and jubilation. Now, the broad content of this verse is pretty clear. It's a beautiful summary of the Chanukah story. Greeks fought against us. They breached the walls of the Beit HaMikdash, defiled the oils. One remnant of a flask remained. A miracle was wrought, and 8 days of Chanukah were established. The poet, though, the Piyut, Moisor, uses poetic terms to describe these events. And when we read poetry, we need to try and understand the metaphors that are being used and why the poet uses this particular language, particularly when the author of this song is assumed to be one of the greats of Jewish history. We don't know exactly who he is, but someone from the era of the Bali Tosfos of Germany, and perhaps a member of their ranks. So it's always difficult to know when one's analyzing poetry exactly what to make of the terms used. But nonetheless, this verse presents several interesting features, which I want to highlight, and perhaps at the end give a midrashic sort of explanation of what's going on over here. And one thing to point out is that the breach of the walls is described as a breach of the walls of the Migdal, the tower. Now, this is a metaphor for presumably the Beis Hamikdash and the walls of the Beis Hamikdash, which were breached. So goes the story that the walls of the temple, the Beis Hamikdash, were breached. Migdal is an interesting terminology to use. We do know there's the use of the word Migdal in Tanakh as a fortress or a tower. Nonetheless, it's certainly not a standard word used for the Beis Hamikdash. Who received the miracle of Chanukah? So here the Jewish people, presumably it's the Jewish people, are referred to as Shoshanim. What exactly is the meaning of the word Shoshanim? So we don't know entirely. It's a common word. The Shoshana is a type of flower referenced in Nach. We're familiar with it perhaps particularly in Shir HaShirim, but other places, Shoshana bein HaChochim, the Shoshana flower or plant between the thorns, Shoshana Ta'amokim, the Shoshana of the Amek, of the valleys. Shoshanas Yaakov also uses on Purim this metaphor of the Shoshana. When we learned Shoshanas Yaakov, actually, I spoke at length about what the Shoshana is and why the metaphor is used there. Sisosov Shoshanim, his lips are like Shoshanim. Someone's lips are described as being like Shoshanim. We don't know entirely what this plant is. It may be the etymology of the word Shoshana is linked to the word Shisha, six, in which case it's telling us it's a six-petaled flower, in which case it wouldn't be the rose, which of course is a five-petaled flower. The comparison to lips is interesting. Maybe it refers to the shape of the petals, in which case, again, it wouldn't be the rose. Or maybe it refers to the color. That's how Rashi understands it. And when you praise someone's lips as being like Shoshanim, you're referring to the color of the lips, that they are red like roses. Rashi certainly led many to believe that the translation is a rose. The Zohar seems to identify the Shoshana as a rose. But whichever flower it is, there's something about this metaphor that is important to us. It seems from the use of the word Shoshana that it's got something to do with resilience. Shoshana bein HaChochim, it's the flower found amongst the thorns, beauty that emerges from amongst the thorns. Again, why exactly is the poet using this terminology to describe the recipients of the Nes, the miracle of Chanukah, the Jewish people in that context? We're familiar with Jewish people being described with that terminology in other cases. Why is it being used here? Finally, the language used to describe the enactors of this festival, the creators of this festival, is B'nai Vina, men of Bina, men of insight, which is also interesting language to use. We could have thought of other terminology to describe those who enacted this takana, this creation of this Yom Tov. They could have been described as Zakenim or Chachomim, as we often refer to them, or even if the needs of the rhythm of the poem demands a form like this, they could have been B'nai Chochma, the children of Chochma, or Chachomim, or B'nai Zikna. Again, what's this terminology of B'nai Vina? People of insight, children of insight, established this festival. What exactly is Bina, and why is this the term used? So these are some of the questions that I'm just using as a springboard, really, from the song to have a look at. Analysis of poetry is always difficult, but I thought it's just a nice way to start off by having a look at this. So what do we know about the history of Chanukah? So the history is difficult. On the top of page 2, I gave a little timeline of when events happened. And if you look at the timeline, I put question marks next to some of the events and no question marks against others of the events. Some I didn't even exactly bother dating. So I'm not going to go into the considerable controversy around the dating of the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash and the building of the second Beis Hamikdash. I simply put the dates in line with the traditional dating of the Seder Olam. The reason I chose the dates of the Seder Olam in this context is because the Seder Olam is one of the midrashim that we will look at later. A little bit of background about the Seder Olam. The Seder Olam is a brisa. That means it's a Tanaitic source that isn't part of the Mishnah, but nonetheless dates to the era of the Mishnah. Its authorship is ascribed to Rabbi Yossi, and it's a work of history somewhat. It's a medrash, but it also includes the dating of many events. And many of the dates that we assume or take for granted when we learn the Torah find their origin in the Seder Olam, because Rashi, by and large, adopts the dating of the Seder Olam. So again, in the context of this Shiur, the series of Shiurim and the Parsha, we've looked at some of the dates in the Torah, but many of the ideas that we're familiar with, such as that Rivka is 3 when she encounters Eliezer, the agent of Avraham and Yitzchak, or that Yitzchak is 40 when he undergoes the Akedah. This is based on Rashi's reading the Psukim, and that in turn is built on the Seder Olam, on this medrash, this historical medrash, the Seder Olam, which is a brisa. The dates often aren't that clear from our own records from the Torah itself. So, however we date the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and the rebuild of the first Beis Hamikdash and rebuilding of the second temple, for the purposes of this outline, I just, for the purposes of simplicity, took the dates of the Seder Olam. It would be a shiur in its own right to look at other alternatives. The men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, important figures that we're going to look at later. And again, we're familiar with them from the first Mishnah in Avos, in Pirkei Avos, in Ethics of Their Fathers, which gives us again a summary of the transmission of the Masorah, and tells us that Moshe to Yeshua to the Zakanim, more commonly known to us as the Shoftim, Shimshon and Yiftach and Gidon and the like, onto the Nevi'im, Shmuel and Eliyahu and Yeshaya and Yirmiyah, and in turn onto the Anshe Knesset Gedolos, the men of the Great Assembly. The words here, Knesses or Knesset, a word that's familiar to us. A Beit Knesset is a place of gathering. The Knesset in Israel is the name given to the parliament. The men of the Great Assembly, these are figures who are around sometime near the start or at the start of the era of the second Beis Hamikdash. Chazal tell us that they include the last of the Nevi'im, the first of the Chachomim, and really the start of Mishnah Avos starts off with figures who are the Mishiori Knesset HaGedolah, the remainders of the men of the Great Assembly. The first Tannaitic sources that we find of the men of the Great Assembly. I've left that undated because exactly how long it flourishes is unclear and depends on some of the other dating episodes. We then get to dates which we know about from secular history. The date of the birth of Alexander the Great, of course born in a backwater of northern Greece or Macedonia, springs across the known world in a remarkable feat of conquest. He's like a comet that briefly blazes across the sky, in a very short space of time, conquers all the way to India, and then dies very suddenly, either from fever or assassinated by jealous generals, or weakened by a life of decadence, whichever version you believe. And Alexander the Great dies. If you look on page 2, where I'm reading from the timeline in our hands out, we see that shortly after his death, the empire split into several parts. There's parts that don't interest us that much in terms of the Jewish story. After Alexander dies, his generals become rivals and carve up his massive empire for themselves. And the one small part of the original empire is based in Macedonia in Greece and has its own mini empire based there. But more significant chunks of the empire are now broken off from their Greek mother territory, and they now form their own region. And we have Egyptian-based Greek empire known as Ptolemaic Egypt, because the rulers of this dynasty take their name from the founder of the dynasty and are known as the Ptolemies, or spelt with a silent P in Hebrew with the Tov Lamed Mem Yod, Ptolemai HaMelech. And this is an empire based in Egypt, and Seleucid Syria based in Syria, and known to us in the Chanukah story as the Syrian Greeks. So what are the Syrian Greeks or the Egyptian Greeks? These are Greeks, descendants and heirs to the great Greek Empire, people who initially are literally Greek, genetically Greek, and bearers of the culture and belief system of Greece, but who have now broken away from the motherland, have now set up their own empire based in another country. Over time, they become assimilated to a degree culturally and to a degree genetically. So they now end up as a mix of Egyptian upper class and Greeks ruling in Egypt. They begin adopting some of the cultural trappings of Egypt, because Egypt is a very sophisticated civilization, and even the Greeks respect it. They adopt some of the gods of the Egyptians. They adopt some of the pharaoh-like practices, and they're based in Egypt. And the Syrian Greeks, or the Greek component of the empire based in Syria, under the rule of the Seleucid family, who in turn also begin mixing with the native Syrian population and adopting some of their practices. You can see geographically how Eretz Yisrael is between Egypt and Syria, and part of the Chanukah story is really 100 years of tragedy that lie behind it, in which Eretz Yisrael is a battlefield. The small Jewish community and is a battlefield in between the Egyptian branch of the Greek Empire and the Syrian branch of the Greek Empire, who are competing constantly over who will rule this small land between the two. And at the time of the Chanukah story, it is the Syrian Greeks who are dominating, and a figure called Antiochus is ruling over the Jewish people. Again, Antiochus is a name of several rulers of the Seleucid Greek Empire. Exactly which one he is seems reasonably clear, but not entirely definitive. And so the Chanukah story takes off. Now, the Jewish people who have been living in Eretz Yisrael haven't really known much independence, because at the time of the rebuilding of the second Beis Hamikdash, as we are familiar, even though they have this little state and they have ownership and access of Yerushalayim, and they're able to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, of course they're not independent. They're still part of the Persian Empire. They never really experience independence, because the Persian Empire falls as Alexander conquers it, and now they become part of initially Alexander's enormous empire, and then later part of these two rump empires, either the Syrian Greek Empire or the Egyptian Greek Empire. The only time they achieve independence is after the Chanukah revolt, during which time, for a brief period, they experience genuine independence, though it remains fraught. And though we celebrate, of course, the Chanukah story, in which they won decisive battles and managed to clear themselves of Syrian Greek rulership, and clear out the Beis Hamikdash and famously light the menorah. This isn't a decisive battle. The descendants of the Maccabean themselves and the descendants, continue to need to fight off Syrian Greek pressure, and continually engage in battle. They know very little peace. They also play off the Egyptian Greek and the Syrian Greek Empire by forming wavering alliances between the two. Sometimes even post-Chanukah, they find themselves allying with the Syrian Greeks, the Seleucid Greek Empire, sometimes with the Egyptian Greeks. And so they sort of struggle along in this semi-independent, fragile state. Now, again, it's a subject for another time, but if you look at the timeline, at some 130 years after the Chanukah story takes place, Herod the Great rises to power. Now, exploring the life of Herod the Great is not a topic for Chanukah Shiur. It's probably a topic for a Tisha B'Av Shiur. But Herod the Great is a pretender to the throne. He is a descendant of Edomi converts to Judaism, either halachically a Jew or perhaps not even halachically a Jew. His father, Antipater, has been an assistant, the right-hand man of the last of the Hashmonaim, who have engaged in civil war. They've brought in the rising power from Italy, the Roman Empire, to help mediate in the civil war between the two brothers of the Hashmonaim dynasty who are fighting each other. Antipater and then later his more famous son Herod manipulate the situation, end up destroying the Hashmonaim family, coming to power by claimed link. Herod claims, or perhaps really does, marry forcibly the last woman of the Hashmonaim, Miriam, and he claims to be a continuation of the Hashmonaim, whilst he is really an imposter. And to a significant degree, he is a puppet king, because once Rome has its claws into Eretz Yisrael, it never lets go. And we know, of course, the events that follow Herod's rule. Some 100 years later, the second Beis Hamikdash is destroyed. But during this 100 years, the rulers of the Jewish people have really only been puppets. Moreover, the trigger of the Herod story is a civil war between two Hashmonaim brothers. And we know that within one generation of the Maccabeim, the leadership of these wonderful and pious brothers, the next generation has already become corroded and corrupted. And we see this by historical records of their behavior, the names they adopt, and the manner in which they begin ruling. For example, they take the kingship to them, which is generally considered to be against halacha, given that they are Kohanim, they're not descendants of the family of Yehuda, and they behave in a corrupted manner. So this is the historical setting of the Chanukah story, a very brief point of light in what is really a very dark time in Jewish history. 200, depending on how you date things, years of Persian occupation, followed by Greek occupation, followed by a brief independent state, ruled over by a family that quickly themselves paradoxically become Hellenized and join the Hellenized Jewish movement, and then finally culminating in an incredible corruption and the destruction of the family and the takeover of Rome. So despite our celebration of Chanukah, when we understand the geographical and historical timeline in which it exists, this is not a simple or good time in Jewish history. In fact, historians know that we have far less information about this period than we have about the periods that precede it and follow it. And this is because this is really in many ways the dark ages of the Jewish people. It's a time in which there's enormous confusion and chaos, culminating, of course, in the eventual destruction of the Beis Hamikdash and this breakdown of the Jewish people into lots of different sects and cults. The Essenes, the sect that would eventually become the Christians, and the Sadducees, and the Hellenized Jews, and the Kanoim, the fanatics, and the whole chaos that emerges from that period. So this is the historic setting of this. If we look at the Rambam, which I printed on page 1, for reasons which aren't entirely clear, the Rambam presents a very brief and sanitized version of this history. We're not going to read through the whole of the Rambam, given the time pressures. But if you look very briefly, this is the Rambam at the beginning of Hilchos Chanukah. It's chapter 3 because the Rambam combines Hilchos Purim and Hilchos Chanukah into one set of halachas. But the first two chapters are about Purim. Chapter Gimel, chapter 3 is about Chanukah. And the Rambam gives us a famous summary. The Greek kingdom issued decrees against the Jewish people, attempting to nullify their faith, refusing to allow them to observe the Torah and the commandments. They extend their hands against their property, their daughters. They enter the Beis Hamikdash. They make it impure. They suffered great difficulties until Hashem delivered us. The sons of the Hashmonaim, the high priests, overcame them. And then the Rambam says, "V'himidu melech min haKohanim." This is the end of Halacha Aleph, Halacha 1. In English, they appointed a king from the Kohanim, from the priests, V'himidu melech, v'chozra malchus Yisrael, yes al masayim shona atachur ben hasheni. And sovereignty, rulership returns to Israel, to the Jewish people, for more than 200 years until the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, there's much to unpick in this Rambam. First of all, the Rambam seems to be okay with the fact that they appoint Kohanim as a king, and this is one mystery in the Rambam. Seems to celebrate the appointment of a king from the Kohanim, seemingly against halacha, though maybe not according to the view of the Rambam. And he also says that Malchus, kingship, returns to the Jewish people for 200 years until the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Again, not entirely clear what the Rambam means. As we saw, genuine Malchus is about 100 years, 120 years, 130 years. After that, you have puppet Malchus for another period of time, and then you really have no independence whatsoever at all. Nonetheless, the Rambam groups this as the return of Malchus to the Jewish people. And this remains somewhat of a puzzle in the history of the Rambam. So far, I think, so familiar. This is a brief summary of what we know about the history and geography of the Chanukah story and who these people, the Syrian Greeks, were. What's fascinating here is there is a midrashic undertone to the story, which is less well known and which I think is fascinating. So we're now going to switch from a political and historical and geographical history to a spiritual history. What's going on behind the scenes? What is the spiritual dynamic at work over here, at least in the thinking of the Midrashim and the Chazals that we have? Or to put this more fully, what is the Chag, what is the Yom Tov of Chanukah? So when we celebrate Pesach and relive Pesach, we know what the theme is. We know what we're celebrating. We know what's the Golus and the Geula, the exile and the redemption. We were in Egypt, and never again have we ended up back under Egyptian rule in that way. Never again were we slaves. Evermore we are B'nai Chorin, we are free people. We're able to have our direct relationship with Hashem. Then we have Yom Tovim, which aren't linked to the Golus Geula cycle. So we have Shavuos. We know what events we are celebrating when we commemorate Shavuos, Matan Torah. Sukkot is a little more complicated, but we know what the Yom Tovim are about. What is the Golus and Geula celebration of Chanukah? What exactly is in what way were we entrapped under Chanukah, Syrian Greek rule? And what's the spiritual revelation that occurred that let us emerge from this? And what lingers, what remains from that revelation? After all, we've had similar periods in our history again. This isn't the last time in Jewish history when there was a dominant culture that was determined to eradicate our practice of our beliefs and our culture and our faith and our emunah and Hashem and our mitzvahs and assimilate us into their empire. What exactly are we reliving as we live through a Chanukah? What is this a festival of? What is this a Yom Tov of? What is the permanent and lingering effect of having been through a Chanukah that led to Chazal creating this Yom Tov, this festival? If it is a Yom Tov which is re-celebrated yearly, that there clearly is something in it which is of significance, and that remains to this day as something of relevance. Now, it is true that had we caved in at that point, there would obviously be no Judaism as we know it today. We simply wouldn't exist. And that is certainly cause for celebration. But a Yom Tov, at least in the understanding of Chazal and in the Midrashic understanding, is more than just we survived. There's something that we can re-experience and relive every year. So what is our journey through a Chanukah? We know the journey that the Torah wants us to make as we go through a Pesach. What is our journey on a Chanukah? How are we meant to emerge changed for having gone through a Chanukah type experience? So let's have a look at some of the Midrashim on this topic and see what emerges. And our first source is source 5 on page 2 in the handout. So those who don't have the handouts, again, I'll post the link on the chat group. And I'll also put it on the YouTube description. And this is from the Medrash Seder Olam, which I spoke about before, a Medrashic history of the world, written during the era of the Tanaim, the Tanaitic era. It's a brisa, it's not a source that makes it into the Mishnah, ascribed to Rabbi Yossi and treated with great reverence by many of our sources, including, of course, Rashi. And the Medrash starts off with a prophetic verse, a prophecy from Daniel. V'omad melech gibor, a mighty king shall stand up, u'mashal mimshal rav, and rule a great dominion, v'asar kitzon, and do according to his will. U'cha'omzo, and as he stands up, shishoveh, he will be broken. Shishoveh malchus, his kingdom will be broken. V'teichot la'abaruchas, and divided towards the four winds of the heaven. So this is a prophecy in Daniel, referring to a great empire, which as it rises will be broken and broken into pieces. So this Medrash understands this prophecy to be referring to the events we've just discussed. Who Alexandrus Makdon? This is Alexander the Macedonian. Shemolach Yud Beis Shana, who ruled 12 years. And after that, as we saw, at the peak of his reign, at the peak of his power and his fame, he dies suddenly. His empire is broken and split into pieces. So this is the Medrash, the Seder Olam, linking the events of Alexander to this Nevuah of Daniel. And now it carries on in a very interesting way. Ad kan hoyu hanavim misnavim b'ruach hakodesh. Until now, the prophets would prophesy with the divine spirit. Mikan ve'elech, from here on, hat oznecha u'shmadu v'chachamim. Incline your ear, this is a quote from a pasuk in Proverbs and Mishneh, and hear the words of the sages. So the Seder Olam is linking a congruence, an alignment between the rise and fall of Alexander, and the cessation of prophecy. What do we know about the cessation of prophecy? Not a lot. We know that upon the return of the Jewish people to build the second Beis HaMikdash, the last of the prophets cease to flourish. There are lingering prophets who join in the founding of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, this post-prophetic era assembly of individuals that run the Jewish people. They make an enormous amount of changes to the structure of how we keep Yiddishkeit. Perhaps their most famous achievement is the fixed text of Tefillah, the Amidah, the Shemona Esra. They get back, the Jews arrive back in the Second Temple, and it becomes apparent that two things. Number one, Hebrew is no longer the spoken tongue, the mother tongue of the majority of Jews. Jews now speak Aramaic. Over their years of exile, they've lost their mother tongue. And B, the majority of Jews are not going to be living in the lands of Israel again for a long time. Much like nowadays, even though Jews could move back to Eretz Israel, a very powerful and significant majority of Jews chose to stay in Bovel, did not move back to Eretz Israel. And for the first time, people realized that exile was not just a temporary aberration, but was going to remain for the foreseeable future a lingering part of Jewish reality. And therefore, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah establish a fixed text of Tefillah. No longer can we just daven as we wish, because we no longer speak Lashon HaKodesh as our mother tongue. Jews would struggle to formulate Tefillah correctly. In Hebrew, Jews would begin davening in their local languages. We don't want a situation where French Jews daven in French, English Jews in English. One can daven in any language, but we want the core text of Tefillah to be in Lashon HaKodesh. Therefore, they established the fixed text of the Amidah and various other such things. So this transition from the leadership of the prophets to the leadership of the sages takes place around this time, around the time of the establishment of the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. The last of the prophets have great students who are referenced in Nach, such as Baruch and Ner, who do not claim prophecy. They do not achieve prophecy themselves, though they are of one generation only after the Nevi'im. And then we have the canonization of Tanakh. The last works accepted by Chazal as prophetic are now sealed. Tanakh is canonized. Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Tiferet Yomim, the last works of Tanakh, and that's it. From now on, Tanakh is no longer being written. We no longer have the ability to write Nevi'im and Ksuvim, the prophets and the prophetically or divinely inspired chronicles. So what is it that's going on at that time that leads to that change? What are the circumstances from the perspective of Chazal, of Medrash, that leads to this cessation of prophecy and the rise of a new form of Torah? And this Medrash links this to Alexander. Does it just mean that this is a coincidental alignment of two events, or is there something more profound going on? The Medrash seems to indicate that these events are connected. We have the rise of the Greek Empire and the cessation of prophecy and the rise of the Chachomim, to whom we now have to listen. The Vilna Gaon, who wrote a commentary on this Medrash, adds a third element to this alignment of historical circumstances. Alexander, prophecy, Chochmah, and something else. Says the Vilna Gaon, Ad kan hayu hanavim, till now with the prophets, Perush, explanations. He's coming to explain this. Mishahargu et hayetzahara, when the evil inclination was killed, Botla hanavua, prophecy ceased. So Vilna Gaon, in his typically cryptic manner, tells us, I have an explanation with this Medrash. If you want to know why prophecy ceased, the answer is because of the killing of the Yetzer Hara, the killing of the evil inclination. So to what event does this Vilna Gaon refer? Let's have a look at source 6 on page 3, where we will learn together a piece of Agadah to Gemara, of Agadah, a Medrash, from the Gemara in Yoma 69, Daf Samach Tes. And I'm going out of order in the Gemara. I printed the Gemara on the page in order, but I numbered it out of order for our convenience. So we're now going to learn the middle of the page, labeled A. And this is from Samach Tes on the base, from 60 to 69b. Omer Rav Item Rabbi Yochanan. So this is a statement from Rav, or some say Rabbi Yochanan, whoever the tradition came from. Baya, woe, woe. Hainu hai to achreve lemiktasha, the kalya lehichole, the kotlinu lekula tzadika.
It is he who has destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, the sanctuary, burnt the temple, killed all the righteous, driven all of Israel into Golus, and he's still dancing amongst us. What does this statement mean? This is a statement ascribed by their tradition to the words of the leaders of the Jewish people upon their return to the land of Israel. Who is he who has done all this damage? The Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah, the inclination for pagan worship. Look, open a Tanakh, read what happens when the Jews arrive back in Eretz Israel, and they go straight back to Avodah Zarah. They go straight back to idol worship. The whole of Nach till this point, again and again and again, the Nevi'im are screaming, don't drift into idol worship. We open and read the depressing chapters of Shoftim, and then we get to Yeshaya and Yirmiyah and Yechezkel and Malachim and the stories of the kings and the split of the kingdom. And again and again and again, you have this running refrain of fear of pagan worship. They get back, they rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, Ezra and Nehemiah arrives at the settlement, the colony of Jews, and the same nonsense is going on again. And they respond in desperation. Woe unto us, what on earth are we going to do about this? The same figure that danced amongst us, killing the righteous, destroying the Beis Hamikdash, sending us into Golus, wreaking havoc and devastation, is still dancing amongst us. Where are we going to go with this? When is this nonsense going to stop? Now, Chazal are building themselves on a historical fact, which is suddenly the attack on Avodah Zarah ceases. The beginning of the Beis Hamikdash, the closing books of Nach, still have this theme of Avodah Zarah being a threat. Suddenly this threat ceases. All sorts of other problems still linger for the Jewish people, but Avodah Zarah is no longer amongst the list. What problems do we have in the Second Temple era? An awful amount. Assimilation, Hellenization, the Greeks, Sinas Chinom, fraternicides, conflict amongst Jew and Jew, terrible things that go on, but no longer Avodah Zarah, no longer idol worship. So they're asking a question. What is it that causes the sudden cessation of idol worship? And in the thinking of the Vilna Gaon, the closure of Tanakh. The closure of Tanakh is linked to the beating at long last of the inclination to worship idols. So once idol worship has been conquered, Tanakh can close. We've now got another era in Jewish history, other things we need to do, important things we need to do, but that's no longer the realm of Tanakh. Tanakh is there, prophecy is there, to lead to the cessation of idol worship. Now, job done, Tanakh can close, tells us the Vilna Gaon. But let's look what the Gemara says. How do they deal with this Yetzer Hara? So now we have a very, very mystical answer to this question. Lo ihu boninon, velo agri boninon. Kolum yavinon loch ela lekibule be'agra. You can look in English. Did he give him to us for anything other than that we may receive reward? We want neither him nor his reward. What is the purpose of temptation in life? In order for us to grow, to get reward. We've had enough. We no longer want the temptation. We no longer want the rewards. The Avodah Zarah is too awful. We can't cope with it. It's just destroying the Jewish people. How do they respond? They sit and fast for 3 days, or and 3 nights, until he was handed over to them. So this is a mystical experience being described, in which the leaders of the Jewish people have the Avodah Zarah, the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah, the evil inclination of idol worship, handed over to them. Well, he's now in their hands. They can do what they want to this evil inclination. And they destroy it. Nofak, Osaki, Guria, Denuram, and Beis Kodesh HaKadoshim. They came forth from the Holy of Holies like a young lion of fire. Amalahu Novi Yisrael, and the final last Novi said to the Jewish people, Yitzrod Avodas Kechovim. This is the evil desire of idolatry. It has been slain. So this is the episode in Jewish history in which the last of the prophets slays the Avodah Zarah, the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah, and we're rid of this temptation for Avodah Zarah, expressed in this Medrash, in this Chazal, in which somehow it's handed over to them and they manage to destroy it. Interestingly, where does the Yetzer Hara leave from? The Kodesh HaKadoshim. So if we ask ourselves, where does it live? It lives in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Remarkable. That's not where I would have located the site of the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah, of idolatry. I would have thought he lives elsewhere. But it seems they experience this manifestation of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination of idol worship, as emerging from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, from the Holy of Holies. What a remarkable place for it to emerge from. Okay, what do we make of this story and how do we understand it? So let's look at another source. And this is the source from the top of page 3, another Gemara. And this Gemara precedes our Gemara, but we're reading it afterwards. And the Gemara tells us about the first encounter of Alexander the Great and the Jewish people. The background is that Alexander is sweeping across the known world, and the delegation of our old enemies, the Kusim, the Samaritans, approach Alexander with libel against the Jews. So don't forget, we're in the era right at the beginning of the Second Temple. The Jews, when they return from exile, find inhabitants of the land there. There's tension between these two groups of inhabitants. Again, look at the stories in Ezra and Nehemiah about the tension. And the Gemara here tells us a tradition that these Kusim approach Alexander the Great and ask him to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. And this is reported to Shimon HaTzadik. Who is Shimon HaTzadik? Well, he's the figure that we're told is Mishiorei Anshe Knesset Gedolah. He is a Kohen Gadol, and he's one of the leaders of the Jewish people, the first generation leaders of the Jewish people post the cessation of prophecy, according to the timeline of the Seder Olam. According to this timeline that I printed on page 2, which is as per the Seder Olam. So he's now in a mess, he's in a quandary. The new emperor is coming, he's conquering the world, he's approaching Yerushalayim. People have got hold of his ear before us and told him that he needs to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. What on earth is going to be? We're in a mess, and with no hope of standing up to him. No one else has stood up to him before. There's no chance that the little rump Jewish state is going to be able to defend itself. So in desperation, let's read what happens. Third line of the Gemara, they tell Shimon HaTzadik, so what does he do? Lovash bigdei kahuna. He dresses himself in the robes of the Kohen Gadol. This after bigdei kahuna, Yisrael imo. They all go out and they meet Alexander the Great. Let's just whiz through this Gemara because of the interest of time. They walk all night. They arrive at dawn. When dawn arises, Alexander sees them and he says, "Who are you?" And they answer, "Who are these people that are approaching?" And his advisors say, "These are the Jews who rebelled against you." So they believed the libel of the Kusim. The sun shines forth, and Alexander is galloping in his carriage towards Yerushalayim, and he sees Shimon HaTzadik approaching. Final lines of this section B at the top of page 3. When he sees Shimon HaTzadik approaching, he descends from his carriage and bows down before him. So his servants say to him, "A great king like you should bow down before this Jew." And he answers, and we'll look at the last words of the Gemara in the middle of page 3 at the end of source B. The image of this one, goes before me and helps me win all my battles. So Alexander the Great says to his followers, "You don't understand, I've met this man before in my dreams, and I always see him going ahead of me in my battles, in my fights." Again, a really interesting and remarkable claim. Now, again, we don't know whenever we're learning our Goda, what's literal, what's metaphorical, what's a historical event, but Gemara is trying to present to us a vision. And it's claiming over here that the Kusim, the deniers of the Torah Shebaal Peh, those who don't accept the oral Torah, libel us to the Greeks. But when the Greeks arrive, they not only do they recognize the right to the Jewish people to continue in the Beis HaMikdash, but Alexander the Great, in the language of the Gemara, somehow sees Shimon HaTzadik as helping and facilitating him in his battles. He's the one who goes ahead of him in battle and smooths the path in front of him. Now, Chazal and Medrash are never telling us stories. They're always trying to convey an idea. And they are making a radical claim over here that it is a Shimon HaTzadik who smooths the path for the Greek conquest of the world. This isn't just a miracle. This isn't just a sort of fantastical and amazing nace or tale that happens. This is Chazal telling us that Alexander the Great recognizes, or at least ought to recognize, that Shimon HaTzadik is an ally of his. He is the one, not just an ally, he's the one that's preceding him in moving forward. So what are we meant to make of all of this? And the answer to the question is a profound midrashic insight, taught to us by this Seder Olam, this work of midrashic history, and the Vilna Gaon's comment on it, in which it's describing two scenarios or two eras of Jewish history and two ways in which we can operate. There's the era in which Avodah Zarah, idol worship, is a supreme challenge for us as Jews. We're drawn powerfully after idol worship, something we struggle to relate to nowadays, because we're living in a profoundly spiritual world, a world in which it is obvious to everyone that as we look at the forces of nature, as we look at the wonders of creation, there is clearly something divine about them. There are clearly spiritual roots to these. This is a profoundly powerful aspect of the human psyche and a profoundly dangerous one. At its best, it gives us this intense connection to spirituality. It gives us the opportunity of nevuah, of prophecy, of directly wishing to connect and engage with Hashem. We live in a world in which we hear the words of God or the gods speaking to us. We don't just look at a sun going across the sky and see this as natural nature at work with definable and humanly graspable rules of nature that explain it, with forces which we humans can channel and challenge and quantify and work with, but we see the direct act of divine will. Whether that divine will is the Ratzon Habora, the divine will of the omniscient, all-powerful God of a monotheist, or whether this is the sun god in its golden chariot walking across the sign, we see this as an expression of will, the will of the divine, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the will of the powers and forces at our work. Nothing happens that isn't an expression of will. This isn't air pressure and electric tension that causes storms and thunder and lightning. This is will at work. This is Ratzon. This is desire. This is agency happening. Whether the agency of HaKadosh Baruch Hu or the agency of the gods, the thunder gods and the storm gods and the cloud gods and the gods of lightning, fighting amongst themselves. But it is obvious to human beings that are existing in that time that what they are witnessing is that of a direct expression of that which is beyond and transcends the mere mortal, the merely human. So this is a time of a time in which God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is present in every human's life. Godliness is present in every human's life, whether in the corruption and corrosion of paganism or in the service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in monotheism. Chazal, in the language of the Medrash, alter and shift that dynamic. We don't know what that means. We don't know how they did it. We don't know what shift occurs. But there's a profound change in how we humans view the world. We no longer see the world as a direct expression of the divine. We no longer see the Ratzon, the will of forces beyond ourselves being directly expressed. And this has, in the language of the Vilna Gaon, two consequences. Consequence number one is the slaying of the Avodah Zarah of paganism. We're no longer attracted to idol worship. It becomes ridiculous to us because we don't see the divinity. We don't live in a world in which the divine is present and part of our lives. It's something removed, it's something more distant. But the price we pay is we also lose prophecy. We no longer hear the words of Hashem speaking to us. We don't live in a world in which we're wandering around and we're seeing everything as a direct expression of the Ratzon of Hashem, such that the best amongst us are capable of hearing the words of Hashem. So something has altered. We no longer directly experience His words. We have lost prophecy, and this is a price worth paying in the arguments of this Medrash in the Gemara and Yoma, in order to no longer be challenged by paganism, which we simply weren't coping with. We simply weren't dealing with. We no longer want neither it nor its reward. We prefer to live in a world with different challenges, somewhat detached from spirituality and divinity, losing prophecy, if the gain we get is that we are no longer tempted by paganism, by Avodah Zarah. Where do we see this force for spiritual connection, this raw energy of spirituality departing from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, from the Holy of Holies? Because the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah, the temptation of paganism, is not a negative force, it's a reality. It's a connection, it's a bond, an energy that draws the divine towards us and into our lives. When we rid ourselves of that connection, it departs from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the place of closest connection and worship of Hashem. In Chazal, as we are familiar with from the Pesukim of the Torah, the prophecy is always experienced by the prophet as emanating from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Bein HaKeruvim, Bein HaBadim, from the Oren located there in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. This is where prophecy is experienced from. The Oren, of course, no longer exists in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. That link is broken around the era of the start of the second Beis HaMikdash. Prophecy is no longer experienced. The great gain of that is the loss of Avodah Zarah. The loss of that is the loss of prophecy. We no longer have that direct connection. What do we have instead? So how do we hear the words of Hashem now? How are we meant to be spiritual beings in this post-prophetic world? Well, the Medrash in the Seder answers that question for us. It says we have another route. Hat oznecha, incline our ears, or shema divrei chachomim. Hear the words of the wise, of Chochmah. Hear the words of wisdom. We have another way of becoming aware of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in our lives, not through that which we see, but through that which we hear, through reason. That which we see, we experience as the external absolute reality. That which we hear, we experience as a reality that we need to assemble and put together by combining the sequence of sounds. We can no longer see, we no longer wander around seeing divinity in the world, but we can still hear it. We can still work it out. We can still strive to understand it. We can still use reason to understand what's going on in the world. And through that, through probing and plumbing the depth of the wonders of nature, of science, the wonders of Torah, we can arrive at a different sort of awareness of God. We can hear Hashem's words in our ears, no longer through the direct communication of prophecy or stroke of Avodah Zarah, but through the communication of wisdom and Chochmah, whether in Torah or beyond. So there's been a shift in how we perceive the world. And this shift is what gives rise to the flourishing of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the founding of Chanuka, the first figures mentioned in our Mishnah, in our origins of Torah, in the flourishing and the spreading of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Torah Sheba'al Peh is many things, but what it primarily is, us humans attempting to hear the word of Hashem and using reason and svara to try and understand what's being told. So with the destruction of the Yetzer Hara of Avodah Zarah, with the cessation of prophecy, with the ridding of this fire, this force in the Kodesh HaKodashim, a new way of relating to the world comes into being. It has its own challenges and own opportunities. The challenges are now that of removing divinity completely. We can choose to live in a world which is completely secular, in which we don't see the divine at all, in which we don't see any message at all. But equally, we can use the power of reason to connect to Hashem no longer through prophecy, but through Chochmah, through reason. And in some respects, this has an advantage over prophecy. The Chazal tell us, Chocham Odif Minovi, a wise person, in some respects, is greater than a prophet. Because we are now hearing from within ourselves the words of Hashem, rather than just for something externally manifested. The example I use for this is that will be the difference between a 3-year-old and a 20-year-old and the relationship with their parents. A 3-year-old, and I've said this in other forums, this analogy, a 3-year-old ostensibly has a closer relationship with their parents. They are hearing constantly the voice of their parents telling them what to do. They're living constantly with their parents. Parents are speaking to them constantly. Did you remember to brush your teeth? Did you remember to wash behind your ears? Did you have supper? It's time to go to bed. Who has a closer relationship with the parents? The 3-year-old or the 20-year-old? 20-year-old is no longer in this direct, constant communication with their parents. They're not hearing their parents voicing, don't run into the roads, make sure you eat your vegetables. But actually, in a deeper level, there's a more profound relationship between them and the little child. Because the little child is hearing this as an external voice, imposing rules, perhaps not always even fully understood. The 20-year-old is hearing that voice, but no longer as an external voice, but something that they've absorbed within themselves. Now there's the possibility of true relationship with their parents, because now they understand and they've internalized the message and values that they have received. So this is the transition that takes place, that Chazal are identifying in this start of the second Beis HaMikdash and this era of the founding of the Beis HaMikdash, the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the cessation of prophecy and the cessation of Avodah Zarah. And here they add another dimension to this, because they say this is connected to the rise of the Greeks. Because of course, with Alexander the Great, the true threat of the Greeks is no longer paganism. The Greeks are moving away from their pagan era, and they are moving to the era of wonderful philosophy. Alexander himself is the student of the philosophers, the student of Aristotle. We're in the era of Socrates and Aristotle, and Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and the flourishing of Greek wisdom, the start of the dawn of what we nowadays would call science, of human reason, of an understanding that the world is following is systematic, that the world is following order, that that human thinking and insight can achieve understanding of the rules through which things operate. This is why we humans no longer see the sun traveling across the sky as a direct representation of will, whether this is the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu or the will of the idols. We now understand this as the wonders of gravity and the force of nature and the scientific rules, and everything that the scientific revolution, first triggered by the Greeks 2,500 years ago, has to tell us. Says Alexander the Great when he sees Shimon HaTzadik, he says, we're walking together. In this figure, in the understanding of Chazal, who in this mystical episode, which we don't understand entirely, creates this shift and the rejigging, the rebalancing of how human beings operate into a world in which we no longer see the divine directly, is that which has paved the way for the spread of my empire, for the spread of my worldview, for the spread of my Greek culture and the rationalism associated with it. Now, we don't understand what's cause and what's effect exactly. When a zeitgeist shifts, when there's this change in the psychology of whole swathes of humanity, and there's these sort of enormous shifts in civilizations, working out the dynamic of it isn't entirely clear. But what Chazal here are indicating is that there's a feedback, there's a link. The shift from prophecy to Torah Sheba'al Peh, primarily generated and driven by human reason, is the same shift as that takes place, where Greeks shift from their pagan worldview to the worldview of human reason being able to conquer things. What do we need to take out of this? That we don't see a contradiction. That in the wonders and beauty of the Greek discovery of the world, we can still see and perceive the divine behind that. But that is the challenge. That is the challenge around which Chanukah revolves. Do we only see HaKadosh Baruch Hu when we tell ourselves that leaves turn gold and red and brown in autumn because they're being painted by a spiritual force? Or can we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in understanding the nature of the seasons and of the rise of and fall of sap in the trees and the drying out of trees and the aging that occurs? To see the divine, to see the spiritual in the Greek worldview, this is what's changed and what's meant to shift in this era of Alexander the Great, of Shimon HaTzadik, and the Seder Olam, which is linking these events: the rise of Alexander, the cessation of prophecy, the rise of the Chachomim, and with the Vilna Gaon's addition, the slaughter, the killing of the Avodah Zarah of the Yetzirah, the inclination of Avodah Zarah. We don't have time to see inside, but in source C, at the bottom of page 3, the third Gemara, which is a continuation of the same Gemara, the Gemara says something amazing. It says, what makes the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, great? What is their great achievement? And I'll read this, I'll say this outside, but you can read this inside. It says that during the era of prophecy, there was a gradual diminution, reduction in awareness of the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem. They were no longer able to see the grandeur and power of Hashem. As Jewish history deteriorated, as miracles ceased, as times became more difficult, we no longer saw how can it be when Jews are being slaughtered, when our temple is being destroyed, when our lands are being overrun. Where is the greatness of Hashem? Until the Anshe Knesset Gedolah came and they restored an awareness of the greatness of Hashem. And they said, by seeing the survival of the Jews amongst in a hostile world, seeing the survival of the Jews in persisting amongst many nations, therein we can see Hashem's greatness. Now, what is it that they could see that the prophets couldn't see? And the answer is, prophets are looking to see. Prophets want to be aware and directly experience Hashem running the world. The prophets say we no longer see that. We're living in dark times. The Anshe Knesset Gedolah are using a different formula, a different algorithm to be aware of Hashem. They're saying we can use reason. When we look at the wonders of Jewish history and we see the survival of the Jewish people, we can't see God's presence like prophets are looking for. They can't sing the praises of Hashem, but we can sing the praises of Hashem because we can reason with his presence. We can become aware of his greatness through reason, through the intellect, through understanding one thing from another, with the rise of Torah Sheba'al Peh, with the era of the rise of Greek thinking in the secular fields and Torah Sheba'al Peh thinking in the Jewish field. I just want to finish off in the 30 seconds remaining, that this is alluded to so beautifully in the language of the Piyut, not just in his reference to Migdal, the tower, which in the symbolism of Shir Hashem is that of the neck, the bridge between the mind and the heart, not just in his reference to Shoshanim, which is that of finding beauty in the thorns, which is what the Anshe Knesset Gedolah are doing in this final source, in which they say in the very struggles and darkness of Jewish history, we can see God's power, but also in the language of B'nai Bina. Bina is this quality of Mavin Dova Mitoch Dova, understanding and deriving one thing from another, the use of human reason. Chochmah, Rashi tells us, is that of wisdom, that of received wisdom. Bina is the Hovin Dova Mitoch Dova, linked etymologically to the word binyan, to build. Ben, a child, that which derives and draws out from something else. B'nai Bina, the unique quality of the Chanukah revolt is those who have insight, who are Maven Dova Mitoch Dova, who understand that the way to respond to the Greek challenge and the brilliance of their insight and their reason and their intellect is for us in turn to respond with intellect. For us to be able to say, yes, we can see you are correct. We can see the beauty of the laws of nature and the wisdom that you've uncovered. And in that we can see God. There's no diminution of the divine presence because we can reason and see where he comes from in the flourishing of Torah Sheba'al Peh. when we ask ourselves, what is the Yom Tov? What is the festival of Chanukah? What remains and lingers from us? It's the most relevant festival of all. And perhaps this is why in divine providence, this remains a celebrated festival, despite the fact that halachically it's relatively minor compared to some of the others. And yet across the Jewish world, this is one that's celebrated. We live in a Greek world. We live in a world in which reason has triumphed. And thank God for that. That's a fantastic thing. But we need to know we have a response to that. Chanukah is the time in which we show that we can cope with it, we can handle it, we can respond to it. Chanukah is the Yom Tov of Torah Shval Peh, it's the Yom Tov of our celebration of human reason, for us engaging with ever greater dedication and depth into understanding where the divine lies, how the divine can be uncovered, not through that raw, visceral, strong, tangible, fiery link that existed in the Holy of Holies, which is linked to, that has the danger of also morphing into idol worship, but through a different channel, the channel of reason and thinking and plumbing the depths of seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world of human intellect and the Torah that we can uncover through so doing. So this is a message of Chanukah and a midrashic reading of the historical events and the medrash understanding of that which lies behind the scenes. Sure, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of you who also joined online.
Thank you so
Wow,
much.
thank you so much. That's amazing.
Absolutely excellent, brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.